It was a late autumn afternoon, and the forest around my old cabin seemed to grow even quieter than usual. The air was cool, with a bite to it that hinted at the coming winter. I had inherited the cabin years ago from an uncle who used to spend months there, lost in the solitude of the woods. It wasn't much, a small, weathered structure tucked into a corner of an isolated valley in northern Michigan. The kind of place that most people would drive right past, oblivious to its existence. I hadn't been back in a while. The place had sat empty for almost 2 years now, ever since I'd taken a job offer that pulled me away from the area. Work had consumed me, and I hadn't thought about the cabin for a long time. But with the weather shifting and a recent wave of nostalgia, I decided it was time to visit. The drive up had been long but uneventful, just miles and miles of dirt roads through a dense thicket of trees. I'd brought along my old dog, Rusty. He had been with me on every adventure, and I wasn't going to leave him behind. The place was just as I remembered it. A few dilapidated sheds, a sagging porch, the smell of pine and earth, and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Nothing had changed. Everything looked worn down, like the world had forgotten about it, but it still held some strange comfort. It wasn't the kind of place you could easily get to, especially with the weather as unpredictable as it had been lately. But it was mine, and there was a certain peace in the solitude it offered. Rusty bounded out of the truck as soon as I parked, sniffing around, probably excited to explore what had been his playground when he was younger. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows across the trees. As I unloaded my gear and settled in, the silence of the forest around me began to settle in too. I didn't mind it at first. The quiet was almost peaceful. I had a few things to do before nightfall: fix the leaky roof, chop some firewood, and maybe get a meal ready for the evening. But as the evening wore on, something about the place started to feel off. It wasn't the cabin itself. It wasn't the forest either. It was just a subtle unease, like being watched, even though I was alone, save for Rusty. He was acting strange, too, restless and sniffing the air, his tail stiff at times, his ears perked as though he was hearing something I couldn't. I tried to brush it off. Rusty was getting older, maybe a little paranoid. I kept busy, fixing the roof, which had a couple of loose shingles, and gathering wood. When the fire was finally going in the stove and the cabin was warm, I sat down in my old recliner and poured a drink. The wind outside howled through the trees, and the fire crackled, but still, the unease lingered. Rusty was curled up on the rug, but his eyes were wide, and every now and then, he'd lift his head as if hearing something. I was just about to get up and check the door when I heard it. A faint thud, like something heavy falling, followed by a dragging sound. It was hard to place at first, and for a moment I thought it might have been an animal, a deer maybe. But it was coming from just outside the cabin. Not from the woods, but from behind the cabin, from the area where the old storage shed sat. I stood up, my heart racing now. The sound was unmistakable. A dragging, shuffling noise that could only mean one thing. Someone or something was out there. Rusty let out a low growl, and I grabbed a flashlight from the shelf near the door. I moved cautiously to the window, peeking out into the darkness. The beam from the flashlight barely cut through the thick shadows cast by the trees and the shed. But there, just behind the cabin, something moved. Slowly, purposefully. I didn't want to believe it, but I had to. Someone was out there. Someone was dragging something. I grabbed my gun from its place above the door and slipped on my boots. Rusty followed me, still uneasy, his ears flat against his head. We stepped out into the cold, the beam of the flashlight bouncing over the old stone path leading to the shed. It was hard to explain exactly what I felt. Fear, certainly, but also something else, something deeper. I had been in the woods before, and I had heard odd noises, seen strange things in the distance, but this was different. The air felt thick, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I reached the shed first, the flashlight flickering a bit in my hand as I swung it around the corner. And then I saw it. There, lying in a heap just beyond the shed's crumbling foundation, was a body. A man's body. He was dressed in a tattered jacket, his face turned toward the ground, and the blood around him was so dark it almost blended with the dirt. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't some wild animal's kill. This was a person, a dead person. I stood there for a long moment, my heart racing, trying to process what I was seeing. How did this man end up here? Why was he dragged? What the hell had happened? Rusty whimpered at my side, his fur bristling, and I realized I was holding my breath, frozen in place. My mind raced, but nothing made sense. I slowly approached the body, my legs shaky, my hand tight around the flashlight. I shined it over the man's face, recoiling slightly when I saw the deep gashes on his neck and arms. This was no accident. Whoever had done this was close, and if they were close, they could still be out here. I stepped back slowly, my thoughts spinning. The cabin wasn't far, but it felt like miles. I needed to get back inside, lock the door, and figure out what to do. I needed to get Rusty and myself to safety. I turned to leave, but then I heard it. A snap of a twig, a shuffle of feet, a breath. Someone was behind me. I spun around, the flashlight now aimed at the sound. But there was nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. The only sign of life was the blood-stained trail leading back to the body. I didn't wait. I didn't need to. I sprinted back toward the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. Rusty barked at my side, urging me to go faster. We reached the cabin door, and I slammed it shut behind us, locking it with trembling hands. I stood there in the dark, the only light coming from the stove, my breath coming in ragged gasps. What the hell was happening? Who was that man? Why was he killed? And more importantly, who had done it? I checked the windows, making sure they were secure, but my eyes kept darting to the darkness outside, expecting to see something move. The wind howled again, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Hours passed before I could even think clearly enough to figure out what to do next. Couldn't just leave. I couldn't let whoever had done this get away, but I also couldn't stay here. The thought of being trapped in this cabin with a killer nearby was unbearable. And the longer I stayed, the more I realized that whoever had dragged that body had been watching me for a while. I didn't know how long it had been since I found the body. Maybe it had been hours or maybe just minutes, but it felt like time had stopped, and I was stuck in this never-ending moment of fear. I decided to leave. There was no other choice. I packed what I could, just enough to survive. Rusty barked when I started the truck, the engine rumbling to life. The air outside was cold, but the truck's heater was a welcome relief. I drove for miles, the road stretching on endlessly, the forest pressing in on both sides. Every turn, every shadow, every flicker of movement had me on edge. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, and Rusty was as quiet as I had ever known him. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stopped at the police station. The officers took my statement, but I didn't stick around to answer any more questions. The cabin was a distant memory now, a place that had become a nightmare. I would never go back. The body in the woods, the dragging sounds, the feeling of being hunted, those were things I couldn't erase from my mind. Whoever had done this was still out there. And though I had left the cabin behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped. Not yet. I was 31 years old the summer I found the cabin. It was July 2017. I had been driving alone through southern Wyoming, not for anything important, just killing time after quitting a job I hated in Denver. The idea was to clear my head before figuring out what was next. I'd packed up my old Chevy Tahoe, grabbed my tent and camping gear, and just hit the road. No real plan, just the open stretches of dry hills, old ranches, abandoned towns, and cattle fences for hundreds of miles. A place where I figured no one could bother me. It was the third day out there, and I was about halfway between Medicine Bow and Saratoga when my truck started acting up. The engine was running rough, coughing and jerking every few minutes. I wasn't worried at first. The Tahoe had been doing that for a while, bad spark plugs, maybe. But when it finally gave out completely on a cracked dirt road that didn't even show up on my GPS, my mood changed fast. I tried to restart it, but the engine only whined and clicked. I sat there a minute, sweating through my t-shirt, looking around. Nothing but hills and dry scrub. No cell signal either. The heat outside was brutal, high 80s, maybe worse. I sat in the cab for a while thinking about what to do. The smart thing would have been to stay with the truck and wait for someone to drive by. But after an hour of sitting there without seeing a soul, I decided I had better find shelter before nightfall. I grabbed my pack, filled a bottle with water from the cooler, and started walking. The sun was already starting to tilt west. Long shadows stretched across the dry ground. I figured there must be a ranch house or something nearby, maybe a few miles. In the distance, about a mile out, I saw a stand of old pine trees. It was the only shade anywhere around, and even though it meant heading off the road, I decided it was my best shot. The hike wasn't easy. The dry ground crumbled under my boots, and every step kicked up dust that stuck to my skin. My mouth was dry by the time I got to the trees. When I stepped into the shade, it felt like walking into another world. Cooler, quieter, and that's when I saw it. Hidden back behind the thickest cluster of pines was an old cabin. Small, maybe one room, with faded wood siding and a roof sagging under the weight of years. The front door was hanging halfway off its hinges, and one of the windows had been shattered. Something about it made me stop cold. It wasn't just that it was abandoned. It was the way it sat there, half swallowed by trees and weeds, like the land had been trying to erase it and hadn't quite finished the job. Still, I needed shelter. Night would be rough without it. Coyotes, snakes, even mountain lions weren't unheard of out here. I forced myself to move forward, crunching over broken twigs and dry grass. The closer I got, the more details I noticed. The wood was dry and splintered, almost gray in places. Rusty nails poked out at odd angles. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of dry rot and dust. The cabin was almost empty. There was a broken chair in one corner, a wood stove whose pipe had long since rusted out, and a small table with one leg snapped off. No signs of recent life, just decades of dust and silence. I decided it would do for the night. It wasn't perfect, but it beat sleeping in the open. I dropped my pack by the door and looked around. There were two small windows, one facing the road and one facing deeper into the trees. Both were so grimy it barely mattered. I kicked some broken wood away from the stove and unrolled my sleeping bag in the corner farthest from the broken window. As I sat up, I tried not to think about how isolated I was. I hadn't seen another car or person in hours, and something about the place felt off. Not haunted, not cursed, just wrong somehow, like it had been abandoned for a reason. The sun sank fast, and the woods outside turned black. Crickets and night birds filled the air with noise. I sat by the door with my last bottle of water and a granola bar, listening to the sounds of the forest. I tried to relax, but something kept gnawing at me. I kept checking the window, scanning the trees. At first, I thought it was just nerves, but around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, crunching in the dry leaves, moving slowly around the side of the cabin. Not a deer or a raccoon. Heavy, deliberate. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. The steps moved around to the back, paused, then circled to the front. I strained my ears but couldn't see anything through the window. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a rusted crowbar I'd found by the stove, and crouched low, barely breathing. Minutes dragged by. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited and waited. Eventually, after what felt like an hour, I forced myself to move. I crept to the window and peered out, expecting to see something, someone, standing there. But there was nothing, just black trees and wind. I told myself it was an animal, coyote maybe, or my imagination, but I didn't sleep much that night. Morning came gray and dull. The sun barely cut through the thick clouds. I packed up fast. The place felt even worse in the daylight. More empty, more wrong. I decided to head back toward the road. Maybe hike until I found a ranch house or flag down a passing truck. But before I left, curiosity got the better of me. I circled around behind the cabin, where I'd heard the footsteps. That's when I saw them. Boot prints, deep in the dry dirt, bigger than mine, fresh, and not just one set, two. They led from the woods right up to the cabin, and then away again, disappearing into the trees. Something tightened in my chest. Whoever it was had been watching me. Maybe more than one person. They could still be out there. I didn't waste another second. I slung my pack over my shoulder and started walking fast, sticking close to the tree line but heading back toward the road. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following. But the woods stayed empty. After an hour, I spotted a fence line, a good sign, ranch land. I followed it until I found a dirt access road and started walking north. Around noon, blistered and exhausted, I found a small ranch house. A woman in her 60s answered the door, suspicious at first, but she softened when she saw how rough I looked. She let me use her landline to call a tow truck from town. As we waited, I asked her if she knew anything about the cabin in the pines. She frowned, shaking her head. That old place? Ain't nobody's lived there since before I was born, she said. Folks round here say some drifters used it back in the 60s. Drug stuff mostly, bad people. Sheriff's men cleared 'em out once or twice. After that, no one bothered with it. Too far off the main road. I told her what I'd heard, what I'd seen. She just nodded like it didn't surprise her. Best stay away from places like that, she said. Things out here don't get fixed when they go wrong. They just get left to rot. The tow truck showed up a few hours later. The guy hauled my Tahoe back into Saratoga. It needed a new fuel pump, nothing cheap but fixable. I spent 2 nights at a motel waiting for the parts to come in. I thought about the cabin a lot while I waited. Whoever had been out there that night, they hadn't just stumbled onto me by accident. They had been watching, waiting. If I hadn't woken up, if I hadn't heard them, the thought still makes my stomach twist. I never went back out there, never wanted to. Sometimes, though, late at night, I think about the cabin. I think about the footprints circling it. I think about how many other lost travelers might have passed by and not been as lucky. And I remind myself that in places like that, out in the middle of nowhere, the scariest thing you can find isn't a ghost. It's another person. My name is David Marshall. I was 32 years old when all of this happened. It was the fall of 2016. I still remember the month exactly, October. I lived in a small town called Parson, about an hour outside Missoula, Montana. Back then, life was getting a little heavy. Work at the mill was slow. My brother had just moved across the country, and my longtime girlfriend and I had broken up that summer. I needed some space from everything. So when an old buddy of mine, Mark, told me about a cabin he and his uncle built near Willow Creek about 20 years ago, I figured it was the perfect place to clear my head. He told me it was simple. No electricity, no running water. Just a little wooden structure tucked into a clearing about 5 miles off an old fire road. Nobody used it anymore. His uncle had passed away, and the property kind of fell into limbo. Nobody really claimed it. I didn't need luxury. I needed silence. I packed light, a couple of blankets, a sleeping bag, a few cans of food, a camping stove, and a rifle. Out here, you didn't go into the woods without a gun, even if it was just for a few nights. The mountains didn't play around. Cougars, bears, even wolves sometimes. Better safe than sorry. I loaded up my old Toyota Tacoma and set out around noon on a Thursday. The drive wasn't long, but the last few miles were rough. The fire road Mark told me about was basically just 2 ruts cutting through the woods. Overgrown, mud in some places. I had to stop twice to clear fallen branches with a hatchet. Felt like nobody had been out there in years. When I finally reached the clearing, it was better than I expected. The cabin was weathered but standing. A simple one-room thing, maybe 15 feet by 15 feet, with a small covered porch out front. A rusty old wood stove sat in the corner, and a pile of long-dead firewood was stacked beside it. The place smelled like pine and old dirt. It wasn't home, but it would do. The first afternoon passed easy. I cleaned the place up a bit, set my sleeping bag down near the stove, and cracked open a can of beans for dinner. I sat on the porch with my boots up, watching the light fade through the trees. By the time it was fully dark, it was cold enough that I lit a fire inside. The cabin warmed quickly, and the sound of the wind in the trees lulled me to sleep. The first night was uneventful. I woke up once or twice to the sound of creaking branches, but nothing out of the ordinary. In a cabin like that, in the middle of nowhere, every little sound felt bigger. I chalked it up to the usual nighttime noises. I slept until mid-morning, then brewed some instant coffee over the camp stove and set off to explore a little. The woods around the cabin were thick. Tall pines and spruce trees choked the sky, letting in just enough light to see a few dozen yards ahead. I followed a game trail that led down to the creek. Willow Creek wasn't much more than a wide stream, cold and fast, with stones worn smooth from the current. I filled a bottle with water and boiled it when I got back, just to be safe. By the second night, the cabin felt less like a stranger's and more like my own little outpost. I spent the evening whittling a stick into a rough little carving and watching the sun go down. It was peaceful. I didn't even light the fire until late. The cold wasn't so bad if you layered up, but that night was different. I woke up around 2 a.m., heart hammering in my chest, not sure why. The fire had gone down to glowing embers. The cabin was cold and dark, and there was a sound outside. First, I thought it was just the wind. It whistled through the trees in strange ways sometimes. But then I heard it again, a kind of shuffle like something dragging across the porch. Slow, deliberate. I sat up quietly, straining to hear. The sound moved to the edge of the porch, then stopped. My rifle leaned against the wall beside me. I picked it up slowly, trying not to make a sound. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the creaking of the trees. Then, clear as day, I heard it. 3 slow knocks against the wall, just beside the door. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. Every instinct in my body told me to stay still. Don't move. Don't make a sound. Whatever was out there wasn't a bear or a wolf. Bears didn't knock. Wolves didn't knock. And nobody knew I was out here, not even Mark. I hadn't told anyone else I was coming. The knocks didn't come again. Instead, after a long pause, I heard footsteps. Not heavy boots, but lighter, more careful. Barefoot almost. They moved off the porch and circled the cabin, crunching softly through the dead leaves. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, rifle in my lap, listening. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, I opened the door cautiously and stepped outside. Nothing. No footprints on the porch. No signs of anything. The forest looked just as it had the day before. Calm. Peaceful. I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a deer. Maybe even my own imagination. Sleep deprivation could do strange things. Still, I didn't feel right. A knot sat low in my gut, twisting. I should have packed up and left right then. I know that now, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I had 2 more days, and I wasn't going to let a little scare ruin it. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I chopped some wood, cleaned out the stove, kept myself busy. I didn't go down to the creek again. I didn't like the idea of being too far away from my shelter. By sunset, the nerves had dulled a bit. I made a small fire outside and cooked a can of chili, eating straight from the pot. The sky was perfectly clear, the stars sharp and cold above me. It almost felt normal again. But as the fire died down, I caught movement at the edge of the clearing. Something standing just beyond the tree line, watching. It was hard to see at first. Just a tall, dark shape. Man sitzt. Not moving. I stared hard, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just a tree stump, a trick of the light. But then it shifted. Not walking exactly, more like slinking. His body seemed wrong somehow. Too thin with long, uneven limbs. It moved silently, one jerky step at a time, circling the clearing just outside the firelight. My stomach turned to ice. I grabbed the rifle and stood up slowly, heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The thing circled once, twice, never coming closer, always just out of full view. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it slipped back into the trees and vanished. I didn't sleep inside that night. I didn't dare. I dragged my sleeping bag into the corner farthest from the door, rifle clutched against my chest, every muscle tight and trembling. Again, the night stretched long. I heard things, twigs snapping, low rustling, the occasional faint thud like a footfall. But nothing came to the cabin. Nothing knocked. To first light, I packed my gear. I didn't even eat breakfast. I shoved everything into the truck, heart pounding, glancing constantly at the woods. I started the engine, backed up, and gunned it down the fire road, bouncing over ruts and branches. I didn't slow down until I hit the county road. It wasn't until I was 15 miles out that I let myself breathe again. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not at first. Who would believe me? Even I wasn't sure what I had seen. I tried to chalk it up to stress. Maybe it was just some weirdo living off the grid. Montana had plenty of them. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't just a man. And it wasn't a bear. It was something else. Something that wore a human shape but didn't move like one. Didn't act like one. I read about skinwalkers later. Old legends from the Navajo and other tribes. Creatures that could mimic the appearance of humans or animals. Evil things. Dangerous things. Maybe that's what it was. Maybe it wasn't. All I know is that something found me out there. And it wasn't natural. I never went back to Willow Creek. A few months later, Mark's family sold the land off cheap. Some out-of-state guy bought it sight unseen. Built a fancy log cabin with solar panels and a big deck. I wonder if he's ever seen it. I wonder if he even knows what's still out there, watching from the trees. Me, I stay closer to town these days. I still go hunting, still camp sometimes. But never alone. Never that deep into the woods. Some places are meant to be left alone. And some things are better left unseen. I never thought I'd end up in a place like that. When I first heard about the cabin from my friend Daniel, I thought he was joking. A cabin in the middle of nowhere, next to a graveyard, deep in the woods? It sounded like the kind of twisted story someone would make up after watching too many horror movies. But it wasn't a joke. It was real. And now, here I was, standing in front of that same cabin on a cold, crisp evening, feeling a strange mix of dread and curiosity settle deep in my stomach. It was late fall, around the beginning of November. The trees were bare, and the air had a sharp bite to it. Daniel had said the cabin had been abandoned for years. It used to belong to an old woodsman who had died in the nearby graveyard. The whole place, including the graveyard, had been abandoned long before I was born. The fact that there was still a graveyard out here, out in the middle of nowhere, made my skin crawl. I wasn't a superstitious person, but there was something about the way Daniel spoke about the place that made me uneasy. The ride up had been rough. The gravel roads were uneven, the trees so thick it felt like they were swallowing the road whole. It had taken nearly 3 hours to get here, and the last stretch had been the worst. The narrow trail was barely passable, and when I finally saw the cabin through the trees, I felt a strange mix of relief and discomfort. The cabin stood there, almost defiant in its isolation, with the graveyard right beside it, the gravestones leaning and weathered from decades of neglect. I checked the time on my phone. It was already nearing dusk, and I knew the sun would set soon. Daniel had mentioned that the place didn't have electricity, just a wood stove for heat and candles for light. If I was going to stay the night, I needed to settle in before it got too dark. I grabbed my bag from the trunk of my car and walked up to the cabin. The first thing I noticed was the smell, the musty scent of old wood, damp and decaying. It wasn't unpleasant, but it had a certain heaviness to it, as though the air itself had absorbed years of silence. As I stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaked under my weight, as if warning me that I wasn't welcome here. Inside, the cabin was small, a one-room affair with a low ceiling and a fireplace on one wall. The furniture was old, worn, mismatched chairs, a rickety table, and a sagging couch that looked like it hadn't been sat on in decades. The wooden floors were covered in layers of dust, and spider webs hung in the corners of the room. A faint draft could be felt in the air, and the window panes rattled slightly with each gust of wind. The graveyard was just beyond the cabin. I hadn't gotten a good look at it when I arrived, but now, standing by the window, I could see the rows of tombstones stretching out into the forest. The setting sun cast long shadows across the graves, and the wind rustled the dead leaves, making the whole place seem even more isolated. The graveyard was almost as old as the cabin, Daniel had told me, and it looked it. Many of the gravestones were cracked or leaning at odd angles, their inscriptions worn away by time. A few looked as if they had been forgotten, with moss and vines creeping over them, hiding the names beneath. As I unpacked my things and started a fire in the stove, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me, nothing more. Still, the longer I stayed, the more uneasy I became. There was something about the place, something wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I went outside to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. The cold hit me immediately, a sharp contrast to the warmth inside the cabin. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the crisp night air, and looked out at the graveyard again. Something caught my eye. One of the gravestones, toward the far end of the graveyard, seemed off. It was a small, weathered stone, barely visible in the fading light. But it wasn't the stone itself that had caught my attention. It was the shape next to it, partially hidden by a large oak tree. A figure, standing still in the dark, watching the cabin. My heart raced, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, the figure was still there, unmoving. It was hard to tell from this distance, but it looked like a person, dressed in dark clothing, their face hidden in shadow. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I had no idea who would be out here at this hour, let alone in the graveyard. Daniel hadn't mentioned anyone living nearby, and there was no one else around for miles. I glanced around the cabin, making sure the door was locked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was an animal or the wind shifting the branches of the trees. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I felt trapped. The cabin, once so inviting in its isolation, now seemed like a prison, and the graveyard felt like it was closing in on me. As the evening wore on, I tried to distract myself. I made dinner, read a book by the fire, and even tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the image of that figure standing in the graveyard flashed in my mind. I could hear the wind howling outside, and the occasional creak of the cabin seemed louder than before, as if it was alive, breathing with me. Around midnight, I woke up with a start. There was a sound, distant but unmistakable, a tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. It was coming from the direction of the graveyard. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of the sound. At first, I thought it was just a branch tapping against the window, but when I listened harder, I realized it was too regular, too human. The tapping continued, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I was alone in the cabin. There was no one else around, or so I thought. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and carefully opened the door, stepping outside into the cold night air. The graveyard was dark, shrouded in shadows, and the tapping sound grew louder. It wasn't coming from the direction of the gravestones. I realized it was coming from behind the cabin, from the woods. I moved toward the sound, my heart hammering in my chest. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the air seemed to grow colder with every passing second. The tapping grew louder still, and then I saw it, a figure not far from the edge of the woods. It was a man, bent over, tapping something against the ground. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The man didn't move when I called out to him, didn't even seem to hear me. He was still, his back to me, tapping a piece of wood against the ground over and over. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I stood there, paralyzed, unable to tear my eyes away. I didn't know how long I stood there, watching him. Maybe it was a minute, maybe it was an hour, but eventually the tapping stopped. The man straightened up and slowly turned around. His face was pale, his eyes wide and vacant, like he hadn't seen another person in years. He didn't say a word, just stared at me, and I could feel my entire body go cold. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I stood there, heart racing, for what felt like forever. Finally, I forced myself to move, backing away from the woods and retreating back into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked every window and door in the cabin, making sure there was no way he could get in. I didn't sleep at all that night. I spent the hours staring at the door. The image of that man burned into my mind. In the morning, I packed up my things and left without a second thought. I didn't look back. I don't know who the man was or what he wanted, but I know one thing. There's something about that place, something ancient and unsettling. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. The rain started falling in heavy sheets, beating against the cabin's windows with a force that felt almost unnatural. It was a late autumn evening, the kind of night when the world outside feels more like a distant memory than a reality. The trees, heavy with the weight of the rain, creaked and swayed in the wind, their branches occasionally scraping against the glass as if trying to claw their way in. I had always been drawn to the isolation of this place. A small, secluded cabin tucked away in the thick of the forest. It was a simple structure, built by an old man who had long since passed. The walls were made of timber, with a low roof that sagged slightly under the weight of the seasons. The real attraction, though, was the large glass wall that took up the front of the cabin. From there, you could see the entire valley, the trees stretching for miles, their outlines blurred by the rain. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where you could almost convince yourself that the world outside didn't exist. Tonight, however, something felt different. The usual calm that settled over me when I arrived here was replaced with a sense of unease. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just the weather playing tricks on my mind. But as I sat in the worn armchair by the fire, watching the flames dance, a gnawing feeling tugged at the edges of my thoughts. It wasn't until I heard the noise that I truly began to feel the shift. At first, it was faint, just a rustling sound, almost like footsteps on the wet ground. I told myself it was just the wind or perhaps an animal, but as the seconds stretched into minutes, the noise persisted, growing louder, more deliberate. I stood up, my heart rate quickening as I moved toward the door. The wind howled outside, but there was no way to tell what might be making that sound. I peered through the frosted glass, trying to make out any shapes in the darkness. The rain blurred my vision, but I could still see the vague outline of something moving in the distance, just beyond the reach of the cabin's light. I stepped back, my pulse racing. The cabin, though secure, felt fragile in that moment, like a fragile shell on a stormy ocean. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself that it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me in the solitude of the night. But something in the air felt wrong, thick with an energy I couldn't quite place. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and stepped outside, the cold rain immediately soaking through my clothes as I made my way toward the front yard. The ground was slick beneath my boots, the mud pulling at my steps as if trying to hold me back. The flashlight's beam cut through the dark, illuminating patches of wet earth, but it didn't seem to reach far enough to reveal anything in the distance. The noise had stopped, but the unsettling feeling remained. I turned in a slow circle, my eyes scanning the shadows for any movement. The trees loomed over me, their dark trunks like silent sentinels. The rain pounded the leaves overhead, drowning out all other sounds. It was the kind of night where the silence between the storms felt as heavy as the air itself. And then I saw him. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the light, but the figure standing at the edge of the forest was unmistakable. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and his silhouette was outlined against the darkness, blending with the trees in a way that seemed too deliberate. There was something about the way he stood, unnaturally still, like he had been there for much longer than I had realized. His head was slightly tilted, as though he was observing me as much as I was observing him. I froze, unsure of what to do. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it loud in my ears. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the man stepped backward into the forest, disappearing into the thick veil of rain. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to process what I had just seen. Was it real? Had I imagined it? There was no logical explanation for it. I knew there was no one else around. This was the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest neighbor. Yet, somehow, I had the distinct feeling that I was being watched, not just from the edge of the forest, but from all around me. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and bolted back to the cabin, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I fumbled for the door. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. My pulse didn't slow. The feeling of being watched didn't fade. I stood by the door for a while, listening to the wind howl outside, the rain still pounding against the windows. But after a time, I forced myself to relax, to breathe deeply and remind myself that nothing had happened. The man, if he had been there at all, was gone now. This was just a momentary lapse in my judgment, brought on by the isolation and the storm. I needed to get some rest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to sit by the fire again, watching the flames crackle, the shadows flickering across the walls. The warmth should have comforted me, but instead, it felt like a false sense of security. My eyes darted to the windows, half expecting to see the man's shadow again. But all I saw was the rain, relentless and unyielding, streaming down the glass. As the night wore on, I tried to dismiss the unease gnawing at me. I closed my eyes, telling myself that it was nothing more than my mind playing tricks. But sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind, made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching, waiting. Around midnight, the power went out. The lights flickered once, then were gone, leaving the cabin bathed in darkness. My stomach twisted with dread, but I forced myself to stay calm. I stood up and grabbed a lantern, the soft glow of its flame barely enough to cut through the thick darkness. I checked the windows again, but all I could see was the heavy rain, now reduced to a steady drizzle. There was no movement outside. I sighed and sat back down, my body tense, my mind racing. And that's when I heard it again, the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps. This time it was closer, much closer. The noise came from the porch, the wooden planks creaking under the weight of something, or someone, moving across them. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I stood up, the lantern trembling in my hand. I crept toward the door, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But I couldn't, not yet. I had to know who or what was out there. I didn't open the door. Instead, I slowly and quietly moved toward the window, peering through the glass. And there, standing in the dim light cast by the lantern, I saw him again. The man from earlier, his face obscured by the shadows, his dark figure almost blending into the night. He was standing there, watching me. For a moment, neither of us moved. But then, with the same deliberate slowness as before, he stepped back into the darkness, disappearing as silently as he had appeared. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I knew was that I had to leave. I had to get out of that cabin, out of that place. I grabbed my bag, throwing things together in a frantic hurry, my hands shaking as I stuffed clothes and supplies inside. I didn't care about anything except getting away from that man, from the feeling that had settled into my bones, cold and unshakable. I grabbed the keys and rushed out of the cabin, running through the rain, the cold biting into my skin. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my hands so cold and numb that it took several tries to get the engine started. But once it roared to life, I sped down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the night, the rain still falling heavily around me. I drove for miles, my heart slowly returning to a more normal rhythm, but the image of that man still burned in my mind. Who was he? What did he want? Why had he been there, watching me? It wasn't until I reached the nearest town that I stopped, pulling into the first gas station I saw. I sat in the car, still trembling, trying to calm myself. The rain had stopped, and the world felt eerily quiet. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and called the local sheriff's department. It wasn't until I spoke with them that I finally found out the truth. The man I had seen, the one who had been watching me, was someone who had been reported missing months ago. His body had never been found. It seemed I wasn't alone that night, but I had been too late to realize it. The cabin was no longer a place of solitude or peace. It had become something else entirely, something that would never leave my thoughts. I never thought that a weekend getaway could go so wrong. It was supposed to be a simple, quiet retreat to clear my head, a break from work, from the city, and from the constant hum of modern life. It had been a long time since I'd spent any real time out in the woods. The plan was to take a solo trip to a cabin that my cousin, Ben, had told me about. He'd stayed there a few times before and swore by its peace and quiet. He told me it was perfect for recharging your batteries. The cabin was located in the foothills of the Adirondacks, tucked away on the edge of a forested area. The drive out was peaceful, the road winding through dense woods that looked like they hadn't changed in decades. The trees were thick and green, the air crisp with the scent of pine and earth. It was late October, so the leaves were just beginning to turn, the reds and yellows standing out against the backdrop of towering trees. I didn't know much about the cabin's history, only that it was an old hunting cabin that had been passed down through Ben's family. They'd never been the kind of people to advertise it or rent it out. In fact, the cabin was so isolated that I wasn't sure if there were any other properties nearby. Ben mentioned a few neighbors, but they seemed few and far between. When I arrived, the first thing that struck me was how quiet it was. No wind, no distant hum of traffic, not even the chirp of a bird in the distance. Just silence. It felt almost unnatural, but in a peaceful way. The cabin itself was small, rustic, with rough-hewn logs and a stone chimney. It was charming in a way, but also a little worn, as though it had seen better days. Still, it had everything I needed. A wood-burning stove, a small kitchen, a loft bedroom, and a porch with a view of the surrounding forest. I unpacked my things, set up a fire in the stove, and settled in for the night. There was no electricity, so the only light came from the fire and a few oil lamps I'd brought with me. The darkness outside was thick, swallowing everything beyond the cabin's windows. The wind had picked up a bit, and I could hear the trees creaking in the breeze. It felt cozy inside, but there was a strange sense of isolation that crept up on me the longer I stayed. As night fell, the silence deepened. I sat in front of the fire, reading a book and sipping on a cup of coffee. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the cabin. Every so often, I'd glance outside, but all I could see was the dark outline of trees. No sign of life. Around 9 p.m., I decided to head to bed. The loft was small but comfortable. I climbed up the wooden ladder and lay down on the bed, listening to the occasional gust of wind howling outside. The house creaked as the wind shifted, and every now and then, I heard something heavier, like the sound of something brushing against the outside walls. I tried to push it out of my mind, telling myself it was just the wind. But the longer I lay there, the more uneasy I became. There was something unsettling about the stillness. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnervingly quiet. The kind of quiet where you start to feel like you're being watched. I tossed and turned for a while, but sleep didn't come. The sensation of being observed, though I couldn't explain why, kept gnawing at me. Finally, I decided to get up and check outside. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I grabbed a flashlight, pulled on my jacket, and opened the front door. The cold air hit me instantly, sharp and biting. I stepped out onto the porch and shone the light out into the darkness. The beam cut through the night, sweeping across the trees, but I didn't see anything unusual. No animals, no movement, just the dark shapes of trees standing like silent sentinels. I stood there for a few moments, listening to the wind rustle the leaves. Then I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible sound, a rustling in the woods just beyond the tree line. It wasn't wind, it was something else. Something moving. I turned the flashlight toward the noise, but there was nothing, just the dark forest. My pulse quickened, and I felt a strange tension in my gut. Was it an animal? Maybe a deer or a bear? It wasn't unusual to hear wildlife in these parts, but this felt different. This felt purposeful. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild, and I turned to go back inside. But as I reached for the door, I heard it again. This time, the rustling was closer, just a few feet away. I froze. The air felt thicker now, as though it had become harder to breathe. My heart pounded in my chest. My instincts were telling me to go inside, lock the door, and not look back, but curiosity got the best of me. I shone the flashlight toward the noise one more time. Nothing. Then, A shape moved just beyond the edge of the woods. A figure, human-sized. I stepped back, heart racing. The beam of the flashlight caught something briefly, just a glimpse. A tall man, standing motionless at the tree line, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette against the dark backdrop of trees. I stumbled back toward the door, barely able to keep my hands steady as I fumbled with the handle. My mind raced, running through all the possibilities. Who was out there? What did they want? The door finally opened, and I slammed it shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I stood there, my back pressed against the door, trying to calm my breathing. The rustling continued, but now it sounded further away, faint, like whatever it was had moved deeper into the woods. I stayed up for hours that night, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to go back outside. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made me jump. The silence had returned, but it wasn't the peaceful kind anymore. It was oppressive, like something was waiting, lurking just beyond the trees. When morning came, I felt like a shell of myself. The air was still thick, but the light of day made everything feel more normal. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just some traveler passing through, or maybe even a hunter. There was nothing unusual, just my overactive mind getting the best of me. I spent the day exploring the surrounding woods, trying to shake off the unease. But by the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, I couldn't deny that the feeling was still there. Something was off. It wasn't just the figure I had seen the night before. It was the way the woods felt, the way the trees seemed to crowd in on the cabin, the way the wind whispered through the branches like a warning. That night, I decided I wasn't going to let my fears control me. I sat up with a drink, listening to music, and watching the fire crackle. I told myself to relax, that I was safe, that nothing was out there. But then came the sound again, a soft rustling, closer this time, not in the woods but around the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I waited, listening. There it was again, a distinct noise, footsteps, soft but deliberate, circling the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight once more and opened the door just enough to slip outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I pushed it aside, straining my ears to listen. The steps were slow and careful, methodical. I didn't dare shine the flashlight just yet. I didn't want to give away my position. I crept around the side of the cabin, moving cautiously, trying to stay hidden. The steps stopped, just beyond the corner of the cabin. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. Then, in the stillness, came the sound of something scraping against the cabin wall. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted back inside, locking the door behind me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I packed my bags in a hurry, throwing everything into the car. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the keys into the ignition. As I pulled out of the driveway, the headlights illuminated the woods for a brief moment, but there was no one in sight. No figure, no movement. The woods looked as calm as they had when I first arrived, but the feeling never left me. That night, I didn't look back. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I was hours away from the cabin. I didn't go back for months, and when I did, I found that the cabin had been abandoned. Ben had told me that his family had sold it, and no one had heard anything about it since. There was no answer to what I had seen, no logical explanation for the figure in the woods or the strange noises around the cabin. But I don't think I'll ever fully shake the feeling that something or someone was out there, waiting. I had never planned to go back. The memories of that place, of the years I spent there with him, were enough to make me want to turn around and drive away the moment I saw the cabin up ahead. But that day I had no choice. It had been years since I'd seen that cabin, and my mind was filled with a strange mixture of dread and something else I couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the fact that, after everything that happened, I still couldn't completely shake off the feelings I had once had. The drive was long, the road winding through dense trees that seemed to stretch on forever, as though the world outside didn't exist. The engine of my car hummed softly, the steady rhythm of the tires on the asphalt offering the only sound in the air. It had been a rainy day, with clouds clinging to the sky like wet blankets, and now the rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and heavy. A cool breeze rustled the leaves, and I could almost hear the trees whispering as I drove past. I glanced at the GPS on my phone. Just a few more miles. That was when I saw it, the cabin. It looked the same as it always had, nestled between the trees like a secret kept hidden from the world. The same rustic wooden structure with a sloping roof and dark, weathered timbers. The windows were dark, no light spilling out from them. There was no sign of life, and for a moment, I wondered if I had been mistaken. Maybe this was just some forgotten corner of the world, left to rot and fade with time. But then, my eyes caught the faintest glint of something in the window. A reflection sent a shiver down my spine. I pulled the car into the gravel driveway, the crunch of the tires breaking the silence that had surrounded me. The cabin sat there like a ghost of my past, a reminder of a time I had hoped to forget. But I wasn't here for nostalgia. I had business to attend to. I stepped out of the car, the cool air biting at my skin as I shut the door behind me. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked toward the front door. My breath formed small clouds in the air, and the weight of my task hung over me like a heavy cloak. I wasn't sure what I expected, but the feeling of dread only seemed to grow stronger the closer I got. Reaching the door, I hesitated. I hadn't been here in years, not since everything had fallen apart. I didn't know why I had come back, but I couldn't turn away now. I needed to see it. I needed to understand. With a creak, the door swung open, and I stepped inside. The air was musty, the scent of old wood and dampness filling my nose. The place hadn't changed much, though the dust was thick in the corners and the furniture had seen better days. The once cozy living room now looked abandoned, forgotten, felt wrong, like it had been empty for much longer than it actually had. The silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by the sound of my breathing and the faint rustling of leaves outside. I walked further inside, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The walls, once covered in photographs and memories of a life we had shared, now stood bare. There were no traces of what had once been a home, just emptiness. I walked to the kitchen, half expecting to find a mess, something that would feel familiar. But it was the same as the rest of the house, empty. The cupboards were bare, the countertops clean, and the sink dry. The refrigerator was turned off, its interior dark and cold. Something caught my eye then, a piece of paper, wedged between the counter and the wall. I bent down to pick it up, the paper yellowed and fragile. As I unfolded it, a wave of recognition hit me. It was a note, one I had written years ago, back when things were still normal. The handwriting was mine, the words so familiar. Asterisk, we need to talk. This isn't working. I can't do this anymore. Asterisk, I stared at the note for a long moment, my fingers trembling as I held it. It was just a note, a fragment of the past, but it carried so much weight. I hadn't realized until then just how much I had left behind when I walked away. It was like stepping back in time, back to the day when everything had shattered. I folded the note back up, my mind racing. What had brought me here? Why couldn't I let go? A faint sound broke the silence, a soft creaking from somewhere deeper inside the cabin. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I listened, but there was nothing more. Just the sound of my own breath. Maybe it was just the house settling. Maybe it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned to leave the kitchen, but as I moved toward the door, I noticed something strange. A shadow flickering across the floor. I stopped. I wasn't imagining it. The shadow was moving, as though something had passed by the window. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct I had told me that I wasn't alone, that someone else was here with me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I glanced around, my heart racing. There was no sign of anyone, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I stepped into the living room again, my eyes scanning every corner, every inch of the space. It was then that I saw it, a figure in the window just beyond the curtain, a silhouette, tall and still. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. There was someone outside, but who? I moved toward the window, the curtains rustling softly as I peered out. My heart pounded in my chest as I searched the darkened yard, but the figure was gone. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? Couldn't be sure. The fear that had gripped me was starting to fade, replaced by a growing unease. This wasn't right. Something was off, and I didn't know how much longer I could stay. I turned to leave, my thoughts consumed by the eerie feeling that seemed to hang in the air. But then I heard it again, the sound of movement from behind me, soft, deliberate, like someone was walking just out of sight. My pulse quickened, and I spun around, but there was nothing there. For a moment, I stood frozen, my mind racing. What was going on? I had come here to put things to rest, to understand why this place still held such a grip on me. But now, the fear that I had buried so long ago was rising to the surface once more. I backed away slowly, my feet dragging across the floor as I made my way toward the door. I needed to leave. Now, as I stepped outside into the cool evening air, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, the trees whispering again. The car was just a short walk away, but with every step, it felt as though the distance grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder, but the cabin remained silent behind me. When I reached the car, I didn't hesitate. I threw open the door, got in, and slammed it shut. I didn't even look back at the cabin as I started the engine. I just drove, my hands gripping the wheel tightly as I sped down the gravel driveway and onto the road. The further I drove, the more the fear began to dissipate, though I couldn't shake the unease that lingered in my chest. It wasn't the cabin that scared me, but the realization that, no matter how far I ran, the past would always be there, just a shadow away. And sometimes the things we leave behind don't stay gone. Eventually, the cabin disappeared from sight, swallowed up by the trees and the night. I didn't look back again, but I knew, deep down, that the feeling would linger with me forever. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away, a much-needed break from the chaos of city life. I'd rented a small cabin tucked in the woods, miles from civilization. No cell service, no internet, just the sound of nature. My plan was simple: disconnect and reset. I figured a couple of days alone would give me some peace and clarity. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, after a 2-hour drive down winding country roads that seemed to go on forever. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth, and the sky was overcast, darkening quicker than I had anticipated. The cabin itself wasn't much, a small, 2-story structure made of aged wood with a single stone chimney. It was exactly what I was looking for. Isolated, rustic, and simple, perfect place to unwind. The woman at the rental office had given me the key and a quick rundown of the place. "Everything you need is inside," she had said. "But just remember, it's pretty remote. If you need anything, it might take a while for someone to get out here." She had smiled, but something about her eyes seemed to linger on me a little too long. like she was trying to tell me something without saying it outright. I didn't think much of it at the time. The kind of place I'd rented wasn't exactly the Ritz, and I didn't expect luxury, but the woman's odd look stayed with me as I drove up to the cabin. I parked the car by the porch, grabbed my bag, and walked up the 3 creaky steps. The door was old, the wood warped and swollen, but it opened with ease. The inside was cozy, dim lighting, a fireplace with a stack of dry wood nearby, and simple furniture. The smell of old wood and earth greeted me as I stepped in, an immediate feeling of seclusion taking hold. There was a faint smell of something else, though, something musty, almost like mildew, but it didn't overpower the room. I set my bag down and took a quick look around. The place had a certain charm to it, despite the slight mustiness. A small kitchen was off to the side, with an old gas stove and a couple of mismatched cabinets. A worn sofa sat in front of the fireplace, and a couple of chairs were scattered around the small room. There was a single staircase leading up to a small loft, which I assumed was the bedroom. The first thing I did was start a fire in the fireplace. I knew the night was going to be cold, and I wanted to settle in and relax before the rain I'd been expecting began to fall. The weather had been unpredictable, but it seemed like I'd just have to deal with whatever came. I went to the kitchen, found some tea, and made a hot cup, deciding to unwind before the storm hit. As I sat there, sipping my tea and staring into the fire, the wind outside began to pick up. It rattled the windows in their frames and caused the trees around the cabin to sway. The rain soon followed, light at first, then heavy, pounding against the roof and the walls. The crackling of the fire and the rhythm of the rain made me feel like I was in my own little world, completely cut off from everything. Felt peaceful at first, but then the solitude started to feel a bit too much. Around 9 p.m., I noticed something strange. The wind outside had died down a bit, and I was still sitting on the couch, flipping through an old book I had found on the shelf. That was when I heard it, distant, almost inaudible at first. Tapping. At first, I assumed it was just the wind causing something to knock against the house. But as I listened, the sound grew louder, more persistent.
Top, top, top.
It wasn't the wind. This was a deliberate sound. Someone, or something, was knocking on the cabin door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I hadn't seen a single car on the road since I'd arrived, and there was no reason anyone would be out here in the middle of the night. I debated whether to ignore it or check. I grabbed the flashlight I had brought with me and slowly stood up. My hand was shaking slightly as I moved towards the door. The knocking continued, rhythmic, almost like a pattern. I peered through the peephole. No one. I opened the door slowly, half expecting some wild animal to dart inside, but the porch was empty. No footprints, no sign of anyone being out there at all. Just the wet wood of the porch and the dark, misty night beyond. The rain had picked up again, harder now, and the night felt colder than before. I quickly closed the door and locked it, a strange feeling crawling up my spine. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the isolation getting to me. I went back to the couch, but now the cabin felt different. The air felt thicker, heavier. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, seemed to make me more and more uneasy. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake in the dim light of the fire, eyes darting around the room, listening intently for any sound that might indicate someone else was here. But there was nothing. No other knocks, no footsteps. Just the wind and the rain outside. I kept the fire burning, knowing it would be foolish to let it die out, especially in this kind of weather. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling exhausted but thankful for the daylight. I had a quick breakfast of cereal and coffee, but the odd feeling lingered. I needed to get out of the cabin for a bit, clear my head. The rain had stopped, leaving everything slick and wet, and the forest around me seemed even more isolated than before. There was no one for miles. I decided to take a short hike. The woods surrounding the cabin were thick and dense, with trails that twisted and turned into the trees. It was the kind of place where you could easily get lost if you weren't careful. As I walked, I noticed the forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects missing. The only noise was the occasional drip of water from the trees overhead. It wasn't long before I found something strange. A small clearing that I hadn't seen before. In the center of it was an old, collapsed structure, what looked like the remains of a small shack. The wood was rotten, overgrown with moss and vines, and the foundation was crumbling. There was something unsettling about it. I had no idea how long it had been there, but the odd part was that there was no sign of a road or any path leading to it. It seemed so out of place. I circled the shack, examining it carefully. The roof had caved in completely, and the walls were splintered. But there was something else, something hidden among the decay. I spotted a small, rusted metal box half buried in the dirt near the base of the shack. It wasn't large, just a small, rectangular box, the kind you might use to store tools or small personal items. I reached down and pulled it out of the mud. It was heavier than I expected. The lid was jammed shut, but with a little effort, I pried it open. Inside was a stack of old papers, all yellowed with age, and a small, leather-bound journal. I flipped through the pages of the journal, its handwriting faded and barely legible. From what I could make out, it seemed to tell the story of a man who had lived here in the cabin, someone who had been alone for a long time. There were notes about his daily routines, his isolation, and then, as I turned the pages, the tone of the writing shifted. The man began to talk about hearing strange noises at night, shadows in the woods, and a feeling of being watched. I felt a chill run through me as I read those words, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The last entry was dated just before the cabin had been abandoned, and it described an encounter the man had with someone or something out in the woods. The entry was frantic, messy, as though written in haste. The last words were, "I'm not alone anymore." Suddenly, the feeling of unease I'd been carrying all weekend came rushing back, stronger than before. I closed the box and quickly buried it back in the ground, feeling a sense of dread settle over me. I had to leave. Now, I didn't wait around to explore any further. I headed back to the cabin, my pace quickening as I neared the clearing's edge. I could feel eyes on me, but when I glanced back, the woods were empty. That night, I packed my things and left, driving back down the same winding roads, unable to shake the feeling that I had uncovered something that was never meant to be found. The rest of the trip was a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight, and when I returned home, I told myself I was done with secluded getaways, done with cabins in the woods. But every time I close my eyes, I can still hear that tapping.
Top, top, top.
And I wonder if I'll ever truly be alone again. It was the fall of 2016 when I decided I needed a break from everything. I had just turned 29 and was working a boring office job in Leeds. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, and my days just blurred together like some bad painting you stare at but don't want to. I was tired of the office, tired of the buses, tired of seeing the same fake smiles every day. I needed to breathe again. So I took a week off and headed north to Cumbria, a part of England I hadn't explored much. A few friends had mentioned the forests up there, endless trails, thick woods, and hills that went on forever. The kind of place you could get lost in a good way. I booked a small room in a bed and breakfast on the edge of a small town called Newby Bridge. It wasn't much, a bed, a kettle, and 4 walls, but I didn't care. I wasn't planning on spending much time inside anyway. The first 3 days went by quietly. Every morning I stuffed a bag with water, sandwiches, a map, and my old Nikon camera. Then I'd set off, walking deep into the forests. The deeper I went, the better I felt. There was something honest about the dirt under your boots and the trees closing around you.
No phones ringing.
No one needing anything, just breathing. By the fourth day, I wanted more. I wanted to go even deeper, somewhere off the beaten paths, away from the little colored markers nailed to trees for tourists. I found a narrow trail that morning, hidden behind thick ferns. It didn't look official. It was muddy, uneven, and partly covered with fallen branches. Perfect. I followed it for hours. The trees grew denser the farther I went, shutting out most of the daylight. It felt cooler there, the air damp and heavy with the smell of wet bark and moss. Birds fluttered somewhere high above, but otherwise, it was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. I didn't mind. I welcomed it. Around midday, I stopped to eat. I sat on a flat rock, unwrapped a soggy sandwich, and chewed slowly, just listening to the sounds around me. That's when I noticed it, the smell. At first, I thought it was just the forest. Wet leaves can smell sour sometimes. But no, this was stronger, staler, like old meat left out too long. I frowned, wiping my mouth, and stood up, looking around. The wind had shifted slightly, carrying it to me. Curiosity got the better of me. I packed up my stuff and started moving toward the smell, careful to mark my path mentally so I could find my way back. After maybe 10 minutes, I saw it, a cabin. It looked ancient, half sunken into the woods like the forest was trying to swallow it whole. Its wooden planks were dark with rot. The roof sagged under the weight of decades of fallen leaves. One window was boarded up. The other gaped open like a missing tooth. I should have left then. Something deep in my gut told me to turn around. But there's this thing about curiosity, it doesn't listen. I crept closer, keeping low, as if I didn't want the cabin to see me. The smell was worse now, rancid, sharp, like something had died inside. The front door hung ajar on rusty hinges. I paused at the threshold, heart hammering, then pushed it open with the tip of my boot. Inside, it was dim and cramped. Dust motes floated in the beams of light slipping through cracks in the walls. A broken chair lay overturned. A fireplace yawned black and empty. Old cans were stacked in a corner. It looked like no one had been here for years. But the smell, it wasn't old. It was fresh. I covered my nose with my sleeve and stepped in. The floor groaned under my weight, and something scurried into the shadows. Maybe a rat. At the back of the cabin was a door. It looked newer than the rest of the place, solid, heavy wood, clean metal hinges. I moved closer, each step slower than the last. That's when I heard it. A muffled thud from behind the door. I froze. Another thud, softer this time, like something shifting, breathing. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound. I was 2 steps from the front door when I heard a loud creak behind me. Instinctively, I turned and saw a figure standing in the back doorway. He was tall, broad shoulders, wearing dirty jeans and a faded green jacket. His face was mostly hidden by the shadows, but I could see his mouth, a thin, tight line. Neither of us moved for a second. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. I bolted. I tore out of that cabin like my life depended on it, because it probably did. I crashed through the undergrowth, not caring how much noise I made. Branches slapped my face. Mud sucked at my boots. I just ran. I could hear him behind me, heavy footsteps pounding the earth. I didn't look back. My chest burned. My legs screamed. But I didn't stop. I didn't think. I just followed the faint memory of my path. That fallen log, that fork in the trail, that crooked tree. At some point, the footsteps grew fainter. Then they stopped. I stumbled into a clearing and collapsed, gasping. I listened, nothing but the blood roaring in my ears. I waited there for what felt like hours, crouched low, heart hammering against my ribs. Eventually, I got up and moved, slower now, checking over my shoulder every few seconds. It took forever, but I finally made it back to the main trail. I practically jogged the last mile back to my car. When I slammed the door shut and locked it, I almost cried. I drove straight back to the B&B, packed my stuff, and left without saying goodbye. I didn't even ask for a refund. I just wanted out. The whole drive back to Leeds, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that man's green jacket appear somewhere behind me. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while, not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because part of me didn't believe it either. It felt like a bad dream stitched into real life. 2 weeks later, I saw an article buried deep in the local news. Missing hiker found dead in Cumbria forest. No suspects, no leads. The photo of the man flashed in my mind. That heavy jacket, that silent stare. I never went hiking alone again after that. Hell, for a while, I barely even went outside unless I had to. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't run. I don't know if he would have killed me or locked me away somewhere worse. I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind rattles the windows just right, I can almost hear the soft creak of that cabin door swinging open. And I remember that not all places that look abandoned really are. I was 35 when I decided to spend a week alone at my uncle's old hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine. It was September of 2018, the air was just starting to cool, and the leaves were beginning to turn. My German shepherd, Duke, came with me. I didn't like the idea of being alone out there without him, and honestly, he didn't like being left alone either. Duke had been my shadow since he was a puppy. Wherever I went, he followed, always calm but always alert. The cabin had been abandoned for about 4 years since my uncle passed away, but it was still standing. It sat on a ridge above a narrow creek, surrounded by towering pines that made the world feel smaller and darker, even in daylight. There was a single dirt road leading up to it, nothing else for miles. I brought enough supplies to last a couple of weeks just in case. Canned food, bottled water, extra clothes, batteries, a few tools, and my uncle's old bolt-action rifle that had sat in my garage for years untouched. It was about a 5-hour drive from my house to the cabin, mostly highway, then a few winding back roads through smaller and smaller towns until there was no town at all. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was just starting to dip below the treetops. I parked the truck about 20 yards from the front porch. The place looked even smaller than I remembered. The wood was weathered gray, the porch sagging slightly in the middle. A few of the windows were boarded up, but the door was still intact. Duke hopped out first, his nose in the air, tail high and stiff. He didn't bark, but he did that low rumble in his chest that meant he was picking up scents he didn't like. I chalked it up to the cabin's age and the animals that must have passed through over the years. The inside was dusty and stale. Cobwebs hung in the corners. The old furniture was still there. A battered couch, a wooden table with 3 chairs, and a rusted-out wood stove that took up half the living room. The kitchen was just a counter with a sink and an ancient propane stove. There was a single bedroom in the back and a tiny bathroom with a busted toilet that never flushed properly. No electricity, no running water. I got to work airing it out, opening windows, sweeping the floor with an old broom, trying to make the place feel a little less dead. Duke paced the room in wide circles, stopping every so often to sniff at the walls or stare into the corners. I figured he just needed time to adjust. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire in the wood stove and cooked some canned chili. Duke slept curled up by the door. The woods outside were alive with sound. Crickets, the occasional owl, but nothing unusual. I slept heavily, the kind of deep sleep that only comes when you're far away from everything. The second day, I spent hiking the nearby trails, trying to get a sense of the land again. It had been years since I was last out here, Everything looked the same but different, more overgrown, wilder. Fallen trees blocked some of the old paths, and the creek had swollen from recent rains. Duke stayed close, weaving ahead and then circling back, nose to the ground, ears up. That night, it started to rain. A steady, cold drizzle that tapped against the roof and turned the dirt outside to mud. I sat by the stove reading an old paperback I found on the shelf, listening to the fire crackle. Duke was restless. He kept getting up, going to the door, whining softly, then sitting back down. I figured he needed to go out, so I pulled on a jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and opened the door. The woods were a wall of darkness. My flashlight barely cut through it. I stood on the porch, waiting for Duke to do his business, but he wouldn't leave the steps. He just stood there, stiff as a board, staring out into the trees. His hackles were up, and that low growl started again. I listened but heard nothing. No footsteps, no branches snapping, nothing but the rain. Still, Duke wouldn't move. His body was tense, his nose twitching. I shined the light into the woods, sweeping back and forth, but the beam just bounced off wet leaves. We went back inside, and I locked the door, sliding the deadbolt into place. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though. It settled over me like a blanket, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. That night, I barely slept. Duke paced back and forth, occasionally stopping to listen at the door or window. A few times, I thought I heard something too. Faint noises in the distance, like sticks breaking or soft thumps against the side of the cabin. Every time I went to check, there was nothing. Morning came gray and heavy. The rain had stopped, but the ground was a mess. I stepped outside to find deep boot prints in the mud around the cabin. They weren't mine. They were bigger than my feet, and they circled the entire place, even up near the back bedroom window. Some were fresh, edges sharp and clear. Whoever made them had been there during the night, close enough to touch the walls. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I wasn't alone out here. I spent the day cleaning up around the cabin, trying to keep busy, but I couldn't focus. Every time Duke barked or stared into the trees, my heart would race. I kept the rifle close, loading it and setting it next to the door. By late afternoon, the sky darkened again, thick with clouds. Another storm was coming. I gathered firewood, double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, and moved some heavy furniture against the back door just in case. I cooked another quick meal, but my appetite was gone. Duke barely touched his food. He stayed pressed to my side, eyes constantly darting to the windows. As night fell, the rain came down hard. Thunder rumbled in the distance. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, the rifle across my lap. I didn't expect to sleep, and I didn't. Around midnight, Duke went stiff. His nose pointed at the front door. He started growling, deep and menacing. I got up slowly, heart hammering, and lifted the rifle. I strained my ears, and through the roar of the rain, I heard it. Footsteps squelching through the mud, slow and deliberate. Someone was outside. I stood frozen, unsure what to do. I didn't want to shoot blindly into the night, but I wasn't about to open the door either. The footsteps stopped just outside the porch. I could hear heavy breathing, raspy and wet, like someone who had been running for a long time. Then came a scratching sound at the door, light at first, then harder, like nails or something sharp dragging along the wood. Duke lunged at the door, barking wildly, and whoever was outside slammed their body against it hard enough to rattle the walls. I backed up, raising the rifle, heart hammering so loud I thought it would drown out everything else. Another slam, then silence. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I stood there, gun up, every muscle aching with tension. Duke growled low, his body rigid. Eventually, I crept to the window and peeked out. The rain blurred everything, but I saw a figure standing just at the edge of the tree line. Tall, broad-shouldered, head tilted slightly like he was studying the cabin. He stood perfectly still, almost blending in with the trees. I couldn't make out his face, just the shape of him. I watched, barely breathing. He didn't move. Finally, he turned and slipped into the trees. Gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the door, rifle in hand, waiting for the footsteps to return. They didn't, but the fear stayed. To first light, I packed up. I didn't care about staying the whole week anymore. I needed to get out of there. I loaded the truck in record time, Duke glued to my side, ears still flat against his skull. As I was strapping the last bag into the truck bed, I noticed something nailed to the cabin's front door. A dead rabbit, gutted and strung up by its own entrails, pinned there like some kind of sick warning. My stomach turned. Duke growled low, his whole body quivering. I got in the truck and slammed the door, locking it. I didn't look back as I drove down the muddy trail, tires slipping and spinning. I kept the rifle loaded and across my lap the whole way. It took hours to get back to the nearest paved road. I didn't stop until I was 2 towns away, pulling into a gas station to catch my breath. Duke sat in the passenger seat, panting heavily, still alert. I reported what happened to the local sheriff. He was an older guy, kind but tired looking. He listened, took notes, said they'd send someone to check it out. I didn't stick around to see what they found. I just wanted to go home. In the weeks that followed, I had a hard time sleeping. Every creak in the house, every shadow outside my window, sent my heart racing. Duke stayed close to me, always between me and the door. I never found out who was out there. The sheriff called once, said they found footprints, lots of them, but no sign of anyone living out there. No camps, no cars, no belongings. Just footprints and a dead rabbit nailed to my uncle's door. I never went back to that cabin. I thought about selling it, but some places aren't meant to be passed on. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and Duke lifts his head, ears pricked towards some sound only he can hear, I wonder if whoever was out there remembers me too. But I'm not going to find out. Not ever again. It was late September of 2013 when I decided to take a break from everything. I had just turned 34, and work had been eating me alive for months. I worked construction, mostly small commercial jobs around the outskirts of Boston, and my knees and back felt 20 years older than they should have. My buddy Kyle had always told me about this old hunting cabin his uncle owned up in rural Vermont, way out near a town called Sutton. It was the kind of place you had to know someone to even find. Kyle said it was empty all year round except for hunting season, and since he was headed up there for deer in a few weeks, he told me I could get a jump on it and have it to myself for some peace and quiet. I didn't think twice about it. By that Friday, I had thrown a few days' worth of clothes into a duffel bag, packed up some canned food, water, a cheap sleeping bag, and headed out in my old Silverado. I left late morning, and by the time I got into Vermont, the sun was already sinking low. The last hour of the drive was nothing but winding dirt roads through thick, dripping forests. It rained almost the whole way there, a steady gray drizzle that made the world look washed out and tired. The cabin itself was exactly what I pictured. A low, squat thing, rough wood, old stone chimney, sitting in a clearing choked with goldenrod and saplings. There was a small shed beside it, tilted a little like it had one bad leg, and the whole area smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke even though nobody had been there in months. There was no electricity, no running water, just an outhouse about 20 yards into the woods behind it. The roof looked okay, though the moss growing on it gave me a little pause. The door was locked with a heavy iron padlock, and Kyle had given me the key. Inside, the air was musty but not terrible. The place was bare bones. One small bedroom with a sagging bed frame and a lumpy mattress, a living space with a dusty wood stove, a crooked table, and 2 battered chairs. A few mouse traps were scattered around. The floor creaked no matter where I stepped. A couple of old oil lamps hung on the wall, and a pile of firewood was stacked neatly by the door. Felt forgotten, but in a good way. I dropped my bag, unrolled the sleeping bag right on top of the mattress without bothering with sheets, and set up a little camp inside. I opened a can of chili, ate it cold with a plastic spoon, and lit one of the oil lamps. I was asleep before 9. The first night was uneventful. I woke up a few times because the woods were alive with noise. Every little snap of a twig or hoot of an owl made me stir, but it wasn't anything that really scared me. I was used to camping, and the sounds of a forest at night were old friends. The second day I spent wandering around. The clearing stretched back into a marshy area, and beyond that, the woods thickened fast. I didn't stray too far, just enough to get my legs moving and breathe in the crisp air. Felt good. By the time the afternoon came, I had built a small fire outside, pulled one of the chairs onto the front stoop, and just sat, listening to the rain start up again. It was around dusk when I noticed something. At the edge of the tree line, maybe 100 yards out, there was a shape. I thought at first it was just a tree stump, but it seemed a little too tall, a little too narrow. It didn't move, not even a little. I rubbed my eyes and squinted, but by then the rain was coming down harder and it was getting dark fast. I told myself it was nothing and went inside. That night, something woke me up. I didn't know what at first. It wasn't a noise. It was more like a feeling. I laid there in the dark, the oil lamp turned down low, listening. The rain tapped steadily on the roof. The wind shifted now and then, making the trees outside groan and creak. Then I heard it, a crunch, deliberate, like a boot stepping down onto wet leaves. I froze. Another step, closer this time. My heart was hammering so loud I could barely hear anything else. I slid quietly off the bed and knelt by the window. The glass was foggy from the lamp's heat, but through it, I could just barely make out the yard. In the faint, gray light of the clouded moon, I saw movement. A man. He was standing halfway between the cabin and the woods, not moving, just standing there. His shape was thin, bony even. His arms hung strangely at his sides, and he looked wrong somehow, like he didn't belong. He wasn't wearing a jacket, and in the cold rain, that made no sense. I ducked away from the window, heart racing. For a long time, I didn't move. I sat with my back against the wall, breathing shallow, listening for any other sound. There was nothing. Finally, when I got up the nerve to peek again, the yard was empty. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a trick of the light, maybe even a deer standing oddly. But part of me knew better. Still, I wasn't about to pack up and run after just one weird night. I was stubborn like that. I kept busy chopping some of the drier firewood from the shed and trying to fix a broken step on the porch. Anything to keep my mind from wandering. I made sure to check the shed, the outhouse, even a few trees nearby for any signs of footprints or disturbed ground. But the rain had wiped everything clean. By afternoon, the wind had picked up and the sky looked bruised and angry. I holed up inside, adding wood to the stove until it was burning hot, and cracked open another can of soup. I remember thinking I should have brought a book. As night fell, the feeling of being watched returned. Stronger this time. Couldn't shake it. I locked the door, shoved one of the chairs up under the handle, and kept the oil lamp burning higher than I normally would have. Somewhere past midnight, I heard the steps again. Slow, heavy, almost thoughtful. I stayed perfectly still. The crunching stopped just outside the cabin on the porch. The wood creaked under a weight that wasn't mine. I stared at the door, my breath caught in my chest. The knob jiggled. Not much, just once, like someone testing it gently. The chair under the handle shifted with a faint scrape. I almost panicked and bolted out the back window, but something in me stayed frozen. I gripped the small hatchet I had been using for firewood so tight my hand cramped. After a long few seconds, the jiggling stopped. The steps retreated, slow and even. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours before I dared move. When the sky finally started to lighten into a murky gray, I packed up. I told myself it was because I needed to get back to work early. I told myself it was because I'd had enough of roughing it. But deep down, I knew better. I threw everything into the truck, barely bothering to organize it. Before I left, I walked once more around the cabin, heart pounding. There, in the soft mud near the steps, were footprints. Big ones, boot prints, definitely a man's. They led from the woods up to the porch, and then back into the trees. No other tracks, no tire marks, no sign of a second person. Just those long, steady strides. I got in my truck and didn't even look back as I drove away. The roads were even worse after all the rain. Thick mud grabbed at my tires, and a few times I thought for sure I'd get stuck. I had to keep wiping the inside of the windshield with my sleeve because the heater couldn't keep up with the damp cold. Every now and then, I thought I saw something in the rearview mirror, a shape at the tree line, but I told myself I was imagining it. It took me nearly 2 hours to get back to a paved road. I didn't stop driving until I crossed back into New Hampshire. I didn't tell Kyle what had happened when I handed back the cabin key. I just said thanks and told him he might want to bring a shotgun with him when he went up for deer season. A week later, Kyle called me. He sounded spooked. He said when he got to the cabin, the front door was cracked open, smashed inward like someone had thrown their whole body against it. Inside, things were tossed around. Chairs broken, wood stove overturned, mattresses slashed. The firewood was gone too. He thought it was vandals, maybe some tweakers or teenagers. I didn't tell him about the man standing in the rain. I didn't tell him about the footsteps, the jiggling doorknob, the footprints in the mud. Because deep down, I had this feeling that whatever had been out there wasn't just passing through. It had been waiting, and if I had made one wrong move, if I had opened the door that night or called out or tried to run, I might have disappeared into those woods forever. Since then, I don't camp alone. I don't stay in cabins I can't see neighbors from. And no matter how peaceful a place looks, I always keep one eye on the tree line, just in case. I don't know what made me take the job. Maybe it was the allure of being isolated in the middle of nowhere, with the promise of peace and solitude. Or maybe it was the idea of being part of something bigger, a project that would challenge me and allow me to build something with my own hands. Whatever the reason, I found myself on a dirt road, winding through dense trees, heading towards a patch of land where I was supposed to build a small cabin for a family from out of town. It was late October when I arrived. The sky had been overcast for days, the kind of weather that made you feel like the world was closing in. The drive had taken longer than expected, and by the time I pulled up to the site, it was already past sunset. The rain had started to come down in sheets, tapping on the roof of the truck with a steady rhythm. I wasn't expecting the storm to be so bad, but there it was, relentless, cold, and biting. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, adding an eerie soundtrack to the otherwise silent forest. I pulled up to the plot of land and got out, trying to shield myself from the rain as I went over the small notes the family had left me. They wanted a small, simple cabin, nothing too extravagant. They said it was meant to be a weekend getaway, a place to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. I could already picture the layout in my mind. A small porch, a living area with a fireplace, a couple of rooms, and maybe a little kitchen. It was the kind of project I had done before, but this one felt different. Maybe it was the location, deep in the forest, far from any signs of civilization. I set to work right away, unloading the tools I'd brought with me. It wasn't ideal starting work so late, but the rain wasn't letting up, and I figured it would be better to get some of the foundation laid before the weather made it impossible to do anything. I worked quickly, setting up a tarp to cover the area where I'd be working. The cold rain seeped into my clothes as I dug the first few holes, marking out the foundation for the cabin. My gloves were soaked through, and my fingers were numb from the cold, but I pushed through it. This wasn't the first time I'd worked in bad weather. By the time the storm really picked up, I had managed to get most of the foundation laid out. I was tired, hungry, and the rain wasn't letting up. I decided it would be best to get inside the truck and wait out the worst of it. The cabin would still be there tomorrow, and I could resume work then. As I climbed into the truck and turned on the engine to get some warmth, I thought about the family who had hired me. They seemed normal enough in their emails, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was something about the way they insisted I build the cabin right away, without delay, as if they were in a rush. I didn't let it bother me too much. It wasn't uncommon for people to want things done quickly, especially when they had an idea in their heads. The rain intensified, hammering against the truck, making it almost impossible to hear anything else. I tried to relax, focusing on the steady rhythm of the rain, but there was a tension in the air that I couldn't shake. The wind howled through the trees, bending them in strange directions, as if they were reaching out toward me. I didn't like the feeling it gave me, like something was watching, but that was just the isolation talking, I told myself. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and tried to get some rest. The storm seemed to go on forever. At some point, I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, the truck's interior light was flickering, and the storm had grown even louder. It sounded like the trees were cracking under the pressure of the wind, and I could hear branches scraping against the side of the truck. The feeling of unease was still there, gnawing at the back of my mind. I checked the time on my phone. It was just past midnight. The rain had turned into a constant, unrelenting downpour, and the wind was so strong that I could see the trees swaying in the distance. I tried to ignore the unsettling noises around me and focused on the task ahead. But then, there was something else. A sound, distant at first, but growing closer. It was the sound of footsteps. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I was alone on the site. There was no one else for miles. I craned my neck to look out of the truck window, but the rain was so thick, I couldn't see anything beyond the faint outline of trees. The footsteps continued, soft at first, but then they got louder, closer. They were coming from the direction of the cabin site. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was an animal or just the wind playing tricks on me. But the longer I listened, the more it became clear that this was no animal. The steps were deliberate, almost rhythmic, like someone walking slowly but purposefully. I got out of the truck, the cold rain soaking me immediately. The storm had worsened, and I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. I grabbed the flashlight from the truck's glove compartment and pointed it towards the cabin site. There was no one there. The area was empty. But then, I saw something in the distance, a figure just standing there at the edge of the tree line. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, and the flashlight beam barely seemed to penetrate the rain. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't just a person standing there. They were hunched over, as if waiting for something, watching. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run back to the truck, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. The figure was still there, unmoving, just outside the light's reach. I took a step forward. The figure didn't react. I took another step. Still nothing. The wind howled louder, and the rain continued to pour down, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. Then something changed. The figure began to move, slowly, as if it had been waiting for me to take a step. My blood ran cold. This wasn't some animal or a trick of the mind. There was someone out there. The figure started walking toward me, not quickly, not threateningly, but steadily with purpose. I stood frozen in place, the flashlight trembling in my hand. It wasn't until the figure was just a few feet away that I realized something about the way it moved. It wasn't human, not in the way I thought. There was something wrong with the way the figure's limbs moved, something unnatural about the way it shuffled closer. I took a step back, my heart racing. The figure kept coming. It was then that I saw its face. Pale, gaunt, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the dark. The breath caught in my throat. I was paralyzed with fear. But then, in an instant, the figure stopped. It stood perfectly still, as if it had been waiting for me to get close enough. The rain fell in heavy sheets, and the wind seemed to die down, leaving an eerie silence. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't hesitate. I ran back to the truck, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I started the engine, my foot pressing down on the gas without thinking. I didn't look back. I drove through the storm, the truck's headlights cutting through the rain as I sped down the dirt road, away from the cabin site, away from whatever that thing was. The next morning, I went back to the site. There was no sign of anyone or anything unusual. The cabin foundation was still there, just as I had left it. The storm had cleared, and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me that night. The thought stayed with me long after I finished the cabin, and I never returned to that patch of woods again. The family was happy with the cabin. They loved it and they paid me well. But for me, it was a place I would never set foot near again. And every time I drive down a dark, quiet road, when the rain begins to fall, I can't help but feel like someone is watching, waiting. I've always enjoyed the quiet, peaceful feeling of a cabin in the woods. It's where I go to escape, to clear my head and put the noise of the world behind me. So when I inherited my uncle's cabin in the remote corners of the United Kingdom, I jumped at the chance to spend some time there. My uncle, an old man who had lived there for decades, had passed away the year before. I'd visited him a few times as a child, but I hadn't been back since. The cabin was nestled on the outskirts of a small village called Grafton, surrounded by dense forest and hills. No one lived around for miles, and that's exactly why I loved it. It was the kind of place where people rarely came to, and when they did, it felt like they were intruding. The only neighbor I had was a man named Peter, a farmer who lived a few miles away. He was a quiet, reclusive person who I'd never really spoken to much, but I didn't mind. I liked the solitude, the silence of nature, the rustling leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird. I thought it would be the perfect retreat to unwind after a rough couple of months in the city. When I arrived at the cabin, everything seemed just as I remembered. The wooden beams, the old fireplace, the slightly sagging roof. It was worn but sturdy, built to last, just like my uncle had always been. There was a smell of pine in the air, the scent of the forest creeping in through the open windows. It was early autumn, and the leaves were turning a crisp gold, with a cool breeze drifting in from the hills. I unpacked my bags, made myself a cup of tea, and sat by the fire, taking it all in. Felt good to be alone. The pressure of the world, of my job, of everything back home, seemed so far away now. The first night, I slept soundly. The bed was old, creaky, but comfortable. I woke up early the next morning to the sound of birds outside and the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. It was peaceful. I decided to take a walk around the grounds. The cabin sat on several acres, with thick trees stretching out in every direction. A few miles into the forest, there was an old stone well, overgrown with ivy, and a stream that wound its way through the trees. My uncle had always warned me not to venture too far into the woods, saying there was something strange about the deeper parts, but I hadn't really given it much thought. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just the same dense forest. I spent the next few days settling in, enjoying the peace and quiet. There were no phones, no Wi-Fi, nothing to distract me. It was just me and nature, but something about the place started to feel a little off. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint at first, just a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. The isolation, maybe, or the memories of my uncle lingering in the old walls. It was all so familiar, yet strange. I shook it off as just the quiet playing tricks on my mind. But then, on the fourth evening, things started to get strange. I had been sitting in the living room, reading a book by the fire, when I heard a sound outside. It wasn't the usual rustle of leaves or the chirp of birds. This was something different. It was the faintest sound, like something or someone was moving through the brush. I stood up, trying to get a better sense of what it was, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. I waited for a moment, listening, but there was nothing. A chill ran down my spine. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The night passed uneventfully, but the next evening, the sound came again. This time, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, the beam cutting through the darkness. The air was damp, the wind picking up, and the trees creaked in the gusts. I made my way toward the forest edge, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. As I reached the tree line, I noticed something odd, a shape moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was a shadow, something cast by the swaying branches, but then it moved again, and I realized it was a person. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was tall, wrapped in a long, dark coat. It was hard to make out much more than that because the moonlight barely broke through the canopy of trees. My first thought was that it was Peter, the farmer, coming to check on me or to warn me about something. But then I remembered that Peter didn't visit at night, especially not this late, and I hadn't seen his car in the driveway for days. The figure moved again, stepping into the shadows between the trees. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching, but then I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, closer than I expected. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Something was wrong. I quickly turned back toward the cabin, walking briskly, but my heart was pounding in my chest. As I neared the cabin's door, I glanced back once more. The figure was gone, vanished into the forest. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me, and sat down by the fire, trying to calm my nerves. It had to be someone passing through the woods, I thought. Maybe someone lost. Or maybe it was my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. But I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just paranoid. But the next few days proved me wrong. On the sixth evening, the noises came again, closer this time. I could hear someone moving around outside the cabin, stepping lightly on the dry leaves. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. Someone was out there, watching. I grabbed the flashlight again and stepped outside, my heart racing. The air was colder tonight, the sky overcast, as if something was about to happen. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but the forest only answered with silence. I felt ridiculous for speaking out loud, but the silence was maddening. I was on edge. Every tree, every shadow seemed to loom closer, pressing in on me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her, a woman. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees, looking straight at me. She was tall, too thin, with long, unkempt hair. Her face was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light, and her eyes seemed to gleam with something I couldn't quite place. I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. She didn't move at first. She just stood there, staring at me with those unblinking eyes. And then, without warning, she turned and disappeared into the woods. Just like that, I ran back to the cabin, locking the door behind me again. I don't know why, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. I couldn't explain it. I had never felt this way before, but something in the pit of my stomach told me that this wasn't just some random person in the woods. There was something deeply wrong about her. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, had me on edge. I kept expecting her to appear again, but she never did. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed my things, made sure everything was in order, and drove out of the woods, away from the cabin. I didn't look back. As I drove through the narrow country roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. Every glance in the rearview mirror made my heart race. I had to keep telling myself it was just the stress, just my nerves. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. When I returned to the city, I tried to put the experience behind me. But I couldn't forget the woman in the woods. I knew I wasn't imagining things. She had been real. There was something about her, something that didn't sit right. A few months later, I found out that Peter, the farmer, had gone missing. Authorities had searched for him for weeks, but he was never found. And then, a year later, there was a news story about a woman who had been found wandering in the woods, disoriented and wild-eyed, claiming that she had been lost for years. When I saw her face on the news, I froze. It was her, the woman from the woods. She was real, and she had been living out there, hiding, waiting. The mystery was never solved. The summer of 2003 was when it all started. I had just turned 25, and my Uncle Roy offered me a chance to get away from the bustle of city life. The invitation was simple enough. Spend a week at his remote farm cabin in the woods near Cedar Ridge, a place he inherited from his father years ago. It was an old cabin, rustic and surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills. To be honest, I wasn't sure what to expect. I didn't think of myself as someone who was into nature, but I needed a break. A week of peace and solitude sounded good, and it would be a nice change from the grind of my office job. I had spent a few weekends at the cabin as a kid, but my memories were hazy, just bits and pieces of laughter around a campfire and a feeling of safety. The years since had changed things. The cabin itself was a time capsule, tucked away in a quiet corner of the world, seemingly forgotten by the hustle of modern life. And that's what appealed to me, I suppose, the promise of an escape. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon, the sun dipping behind the thick tree line. The gravel driveway leading up to the cabin was rough and uneven. I had to slow the car down just to avoid hitting a large stone that seemed to have rolled into the path. My uncle's truck wasn't parked there yet, so I assumed he wouldn't be arriving until later that evening. He had told me he was just coming up for the weekend to help with some repairs, but it was clear I would be on my own for at least the first few hours. The first thing I noticed when I parked was the stillness. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the occasional chirping of birds and the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. It felt almost too quiet, like the woods were holding their breath. I felt a strange sense of unease settle in, but I shrugged it off. The cabin looked just as I remembered. Wooden exterior, small windows, a rickety porch with a couple of chairs. It was a humble place, but it had its charm. After unloading my things, I went inside. The door creaked on its hinges, but it still opened without much effort. The interior was much the same: worn wooden floors, old furniture, and a faint smell of wood and dust. The stone fireplace in the living room stood tall and imposing, a relic of an earlier time when it had been used to heat the entire cabin. The walls were lined with old hunting trophies and family photos, the kind of things that made you feel like you were stepping into someone's history. I unpacked my gear, setting up a small bed in the corner of the cabin, near the window that overlooked the woods. The glass was slightly cracked, but it wasn't enough to cause any problems. I noticed a few cobwebs in the corners and dust on the shelves, but nothing too alarming. It was clear this place hadn't seen much use in the last few months. As evening approached, I decided to start a fire in the fireplace. The dry logs my uncle had stacked near the door caught easily, and soon the crackling flames filled the room with warmth. I sat in one of the old wooden chairs, letting the fire's light dance across the walls. My phone had no service, and I wasn't expecting to see anyone for a while. The solitude felt heavier than I anticipated. It was odd, but there was something about this cabin that gave me the chills. The stillness, the creaking of the house settling as the night deepened. It all added to the feeling that I was being watched. I dismissed it, telling myself it was just my imagination. As the night went on, I cooked myself a simple dinner, something quick and easy, spaghetti and sauce from a can. The cabin seemed to get quieter as the hours passed. The wind had died down, and even the distant sounds of wildlife seemed to fade. There was a point when I looked up from my plate, expecting to see something moving outside the window, but the night was pitch black. The trees swayed gently, casting long shadows across the ground. For a moment, I thought I saw a shape standing just beyond the reach of the light from the window, but when I blinked, it was gone. I shook it off as paranoia, but the feeling didn't go away. The weight in the air seemed to grow heavier as I finished my meal and cleaned up. When the sun finally set and the last bit of light faded from the horizon, I decided it was time to turn in. The old bed creaked as I laid down under a thick quilt, its faded pattern reminding me of childhood summers spent in this very cabin. But I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, thoughts swirling with unease, until exhaustion finally overtook me. I awoke later in the night to the sound of something, perhaps a twig snapping, coming from outside. I lay still, straining to listen. There was no wind, no animals, just an eerie silence that seemed to press against the walls of the cabin. I glanced at the window. The shadows of the trees looked like dark, looming figures under the pale moonlight. And then, just at the edge of the darkness, I saw it. A shape. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though it was avoiding the light of the cabin. My heart thudded in my chest. I waited for what felt like hours before I dared move. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer beside my bed and crept toward the front door, careful not to make a sound. The handle was cold in my hand, and for a moment, I just stood there, frozen. The unease had deepened, turning into something like fear. But fear of what? I wasn't sure. The logical part of me told me it was just a deer or some other animal. The irrational part told me that something was watching me, something that didn't belong. I slowly opened the door, my hand shaking. The flashlight beam cut through the night, but there was nothing in sight. No figure, no movement, just the quiet expanse of trees stretching out into the blackness. I stepped outside, the cool night air biting at my skin, and walked toward the edge of the porch. The beam of light flickered and caught the edge of something. A small patch of earth had been disturbed, as though someone had recently been digging. I crouched down, my heart racing. There was no sign of a trail, nothing that led back to a person or animal. The ground was soft, the earth recently turned, but there was no reason for it to be like that, not in the middle of nowhere. I quickly backed up, heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't right. I could feel the tension tightening in my chest. I had to get inside. Fast. My feet stumbled over the uneven ground, but I managed to make it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. The rest of the night passed in fitful sleep, but in the morning, I had to make sense of it. I had to know what had happened the night before. I grabbed my things and went outside to investigate, my nerves still on edge. The disturbed earth was just as I had left it, but this time I noticed something else. A set of footprints. Bare footprints, large and uneven, leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the woods. Panic rose in my throat. There was no way I was staying here another night alone. I called my uncle, but of course his phone went straight to voicemail. I had to leave, and I wasn't staying one more minute in that cabin. I packed my things, got in my car, and left. As I drove down the rough gravel road, my eyes darted to the trees, expecting to see someone or something watching me, but nothing, just the silence of the woods. By the time I got to the highway, the sun was high in the sky. The tension I had felt the night before started to ease, but the unease lingered, like a bad taste in my mouth. I never did find out what happened at the cabin or who or what was out there, but I know one thing for sure: I'm never going back.